Hey, thanks for clicking. Today in the wood shop, we're going to make a couple of easy projects that every beginner woodworker should make for themselves because they're handy to have in the wood shop. First thing is I'm going to get rid of this nasty old push stick that I hastily made while I was working on the house and replace it with a much better one. And then we'll get to the second project. So here we go. What I'm starting with here is just a piece of standard 2x6 lumber, 18 inches long, and I'm just ripping the edge off to get a straight, flat surface on that edge with square corners. I'm only doing that to one edge, and that will be the bottom. Then on one end, I'm measuring up 1.5 inches, making a mark. Then measuring over from the same end at the top, 12 inches. Then I connect the dots and make a cut line. On the other end, I'm measuring over 3.5 inches and then down 1.75 inches. Then I took this to the miter saw to make these cuts. Maybe not the safest way to do it, so if you do it this way, be careful. I clamped this piece of plywood on there to support the board out away from the fence to help stabilize it. The long cut ended up to be around 17.5 degree setting on the saw, but that's not critical. And yes, I do need a new blade. The shortcut ended up around 26.5 degrees, I think. Again, not critical. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut a slot in here to make a handle. And all these marks on here were me figuring out the measurements that I want to use. What I ended up with is I came over from this point 1.5 inches. Well, first I drew this reference line on here, and that's 1 5/8 over parallel to this cut. And then I came over here 1.5 inches and then 3.5 to that point, and that's where I'm going to drill a 1-inch hole with a Forstner bit there, and then connect the two with a jigsaw. Ready to drill some holes at the drill press. I fiddle around with it and get it all lined up and ready to roll, and no power. I can attest to the fact that these things work much better when they're plugged into an outlet. There we go. Okay, let's try this again. Much better. I'm using a 1-inch Forstner bit, and I've got a piece of sacrificial plywood under it so I can cut all the way through and not crash the bit into the steel table. And I'm drilling a hole at each end of the slot that will be the handle. Then I just mark from the edge of each hole to the other one and make a couple of cuts, and I have a slot. Now I'm making a notch at the back of the piece at the handle end, and I'll show you what that's for in a few minutes. I make 2 passes, moving it over the width of the blade to make it about 1/4 inch deep, and the saw blade is cutting up about 1.5 inches from the bottom. You could also cut this notch with a handsaw pretty easy. Time to ease all these edges with a 1/4 inch roundover bit in the router. I'm hitting the inside of the handle and all the edges except the bottom, and I stop short of where the notch is. And of course, doing both sides. And here's what that notch is for. It's going to hold this heel piece that will hang down and hook the back of the board that's being pushed through the saw. I cut it from the scrap piece I cut off the front at the miter saw, and I cut it to hang down about 1/4 inch, and that's all you really need. And a single screw will hold it. I'll go into a little more detail about that later. And no project is without sanding. Power sanding and some hand sanding. Now to try it out. Hey, it works. I'm happy with it. Well, old timer, your day is done. This should be a much better push stick. So the second project I'm going to make is a wooden mallet because I need one and I don't have one. So I'm going to make my own. And I'm going to do it what I consider to be the simplest and easiest way, and I'll show you that. So I picked out a couple pieces of hardwood, and I'm not even sure what this first wood is. I ripped it to 3 inches wide on the table saw, and I'm cutting 2 pieces 4.5 inches long at the miter saw. This lighter colored wood is hickory, and I'm using that for the handle and the inner pieces of the head. I also ripped that to 3 inches wide, and I'm cutting 2 pieces 2 inches long. The handle is the same thickness, ripped to 1.25 inches wide, and here I'm chamfering the edges from a line at 1.25 inches from one end and 3.5 from the other end. And I'm just eyeballing the start and stop points, just lining up my marked lines with the center of the bit. So we got all our pieces to the mallet here, and we're going to assemble these. And just so you know, my handle is 13 inches long, and it is about 7/8 inch thick by 1.25 inches wide. And that's what feels good in my hand. If you make it that way and it doesn't feel good to you, thin it down in one direction or the other and make it feel good to you. So what I'm going to do here, so these are the center sections, and these are the outer sections, and these are 4.5 long, 3 inches wide, and about 3/4 of an inch thick. The center ones are a little bit thicker. They're about 7/8, and they're 2 inches by 3 inches. And it doesn't matter that the outer ones and the inner ones are different thicknesses, as long as these 3 pieces are the same thickness, because you're going to glue this together, or that's the way I'm going to do it anyway. And if you attempt to make one, so that's the general configuration that it's going to go together as. And what I'm going to do is, there's my line on there. I'm going to put these 2 pieces to that line, and those 3 pieces like that. I'm going to glue it and put a couple of brad nails to hold these in place while I glue the rest of it up and get it in clamps. So these brad nails are just going to be to hold these pieces together, and then I'll clamp the rest of it together. So I start out just putting glue down for the first piece, and that's so I can use my square here and make sure the handle ends up at 90 degrees. My apologies for not having this framed up a little better here. I put it on a tripod and I use my phone with the back camera, and I can't see the screen from the side that I'm working from here. I'll have to work on that in the future. And of course the nails didn't quite go all the way in, so I had to finish them with a nail set, which distracted me from my plan to take the handle out and put some more glue in there on the sides of it. So I forgot to do that. I could have used a little more glue here too. I did get some squeeze out, but more would have been better. I gave it a couple hours to dry and then took it out of the clamps and sanded off the end of the handle that was proud of the head. Then it's over to the miter saw again and put a taper on the head. I'm going with 3 degrees here, which I think is about right. I got it clamped to the fence to stabilize it for the cut. I marked the center of the head on both sides and then put a mark on the fence so I can just flip it and line up the marks and get the cuts even on each side. You can probably tell I installed a new blade. Cuts like butter. Back over to the router table and put the same chamfer on all the edges of the head that I did to the handle. This not only makes it look better, but also makes it less likely that errant impacts will split out or chip the edges. I think that looks pretty good. And of course this gets some sanding as well. I took the edges off the chamfer on the handle a bit too. Here are the finished products. And first we'll talk about the push stick. I made this thing just kind of in the shape that I thought would be handy. And does it have to be this long? Not really, but I made it this long so I can have good purchase on the whatever I'm pushing through, but also so I can reach out and push something off onto the outfeed table if I need to. And I made it this shape to with this handle to be able to have a couple of positions. I get behind it with the heel of my hand or choke up high on it. The handle slot here is so you don't have any errant fingers sticking down. You wrap around that handle and keep your fingers up out of the way. I notched this heel in back here so I could attach with one screw and not have it want to twist or turn. With that notch in there, it holds it straight, and I can keep that screw well up out of the way of the saw as it's coming, the blade as it's coming through. I later went back and notched it just so the width on this thing, and the reason I made it wide is so it can sit upright on the saw and be easy to grab when you're cutting. And I went back and cut this notch in here because of the width. You can't always get in between the fence and the blade. So this way I can straddle the blade and not have the resistance of the blade cutting into the bottom of the push stick and maybe not chew it up as much. This will get chewed up, and basically these are so easy to make. It's a disposable item, and obviously this is disposable. You can cut through that. When it gets chewed up on the bottom, just cut a new one, put it on there. And then the other thing, you'll notice there's a little bit of a extra notch there, and that's because my table saw decided to raise the blade all on its own. So I had to adjust the tension on the adjuster and tighten that up a little bit. But so that's the defect in this piece. But this should work for a while, and I may make a different size and shape one also, because it doesn't hurt to have 2 or 3 of these around. Okay, now for the mallet. Like I say, I made this about the easiest way I could and glued it all together. There's different ways of doing these with the handles. I just glued mine in. You can make it so you make the head separate and the handle separate, and then install the handle and drive wedges in here. If you slot the handle and then put wedges in to tighten it up, that's another way of doing it. Another way is to your inner pieces and the handle cut to like a 2 or 3 degree angle and make a tapered handle that slides in and just is a friction fit. I did it this way, just a simple, easy way to do it, and I think it should last. If the handle loosens up, well, then I'll just make another one, slotted, and insert it and put wedges in it. But I ended up with the defect in this piece. I always seem to end up with a defect. Right there, I don't know if you can see that very well. Ended up with a little chunk of metal that was on the bench. And when I set this on it, and I think when I was setting the nails in those first two blocks, it indented that piece of metal in there. So I just filled it with some CA glue, and it's kind of on a dark part of the grain, so it's not too noticeable, but this is a utilitarian piece. It's not a show piece, so it'll still work just fine. So that's about it. The other thing I was going to say is I chamfered the edges on here and down to a point where it just kind of blends into the handle. And I left this a little bit bigger at the end just for comfort and retention. It's not like you're going to be wailing on anything with this. A lot of times you're choked up on it anyway if you're using it with a chisel or a gouge or something like that. But there you go. So 2 useful tools, and they were kind of fun to make. So get out there and make some sawdust and make some for yourself. See you next time.